I never believed in ghosts, curses, or the supernatural. That is, until I found myself alone in the dimly lit corridors of Greystone High School, a place riddled with whispers about Room 13, a classroom sealed off for decades. They said a teacher lost her mind there and took the lives of her students before vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only blood-stained walls and an eerie silence that no amount of repainting could erase. My curiosity got the better of me when I was dared to spend the night there, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone. The school felt alive as I walked through it at midnight, each creak of the floorboards and faint echo of my own footsteps amplifying my unease. The air grew colder as I approached the forbidden door at the end of the west wing, its peeling paint and rusted padlock doing little to obscure the malevolent energy radiating from it. As if guided by unseen hands, the lock clicked open when I touched it, and the door creaked ajar, revealing a room trapped in time, its desks overturned and blackboards scribbled with faded words I couldn't decipher. The smell of mildew and something metallic, blood maybe, made my stomach churn, but what really froze me in place was the sudden tap, tap, tap of small, ghostly fingers on the frosted window, despite the fact that it was on the third floor. My flashlight flickered as a soft, childlike giggle echoed from behind me, though I was certain no one else had entered. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the suffocating darkness, thick like a living thing, pressing against my skin. The giggling turned into whispers, dozens of them, all overlapping in a cacophony of unintelligible words, and then came the scratching, deep, guttural scratches against the blackboard, as if something with claws was desperate to escape. My phone screen lit up suddenly, revealing a string of notifications. "Get out," repeated over and over again, sent from my own number. My breath hitched as the temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the desks, and that's when I saw her, the teacher or what was left of her. She was standing at the corner, her face obscured by long, matted hair, but her hollow, gaping mouth stretched wide enough to swallow my screams as she raised a blood-soaked ruler in one skeletal hand. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut on its own, the lock twisting back into place with a deafening click. The walls seemed to close in, pulsing with the cries of invisible children, their disembodied voices begging me to save them, to run, to stay, to die. My flashlight dropped to the floor, spinning wildly as the teacher lunged at me, her eyes, or what used to be eyes, glowing with a sickly yellow light. I don't remember much after that, only flashes of pain, her nails raking against my skin, and a chorus of laughter. Deep, guttural laughter that didn't belong to children or anything human. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was outside the school, clutching my phone, which now displayed a single text, "You're next." I never spoke of what happened, but every night since, I hear those same whispers, the same scratching, growing louder and closer as if the horrors of Room 13 had followed me home. They always warned us about the forgotten hallway at St. Eustace High, a corridor buried deep beneath the main building, hidden behind a rusted metal door in the basement that most people didn't even notice. The teachers never spoke about it, but the students passed down stories of how it had been closed off years ago after a janitor disappeared there, his screams echoing through the vents for hours before abruptly stopping. Of course, it was just another school legend. At least that's what I told myself when I agreed to go there after school on a dare. My friends waited near the basement stairs while I ventured alone with only my phone flashlight. As soon as I descended, the air grew thick, humid, and unnaturally cold, like the basement existed in its own pocket of reality. The metal door was exactly where they said it would be, covered in claw-like scratches and splattered with something dark and dry that I prayed wasn't blood. With a deep breath, I pushed it open, and the sound of groaning hinges reverberated down the hall. The stench hit me first, something sour and decayed, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. My light barely penetrated the blackness ahead, revealing only cracked tiles and walls lined with lockers that seemed too old to belong to our school. The deeper I walked, the stranger it became. The lockers were dented, some with locks dangling open, and faint whispers filled the air, low and guttural, like someone struggling to form words just out of earshot. My flashlight flickered, and I swore I saw movement at the edge of the beam, a shadow that wasn't mine, darting across the hall. I tried to turn back, but the door I'd come through was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions now, the walls pulsing faintly as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could finally make out their words. Turn around, keep going, stay forever. My chest tightened, but I pressed forward, convinced that the only way out was ahead. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched by one of the lockers, its back to me, its body contorted in a way that no human could manage. It rocked slowly, muttering to itself in a language I didn't recognize. My footsteps faltered, and the sound made it freeze. Slowly, its head turned impossibly far until its face was visible. Eyeless sockets weeping black fluid, a mouth stretched into a grin that split its cheeks. It lunged, and I ran, my feet pounding the floor as the thing's laughter followed me. High-pitched and childlike, yet filled with malice. The hallway twisted and warped around me, lockers slamming open and shut, their doors spewing out books and papers covered in unrecognizable symbols. The air was thick with whispers and screams, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from inside my head. I tripped over something, a shoe old and decayed, still attached to a skeletal foot. That's when I realized the floor was littered with bones, some small, like children's, others larger, as if adults had also been trapped here. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Then I saw the door, an old wooden one that didn't belong, glowing faintly at the end of the hall. I sprinted toward it, the laughter behind me growing louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on my neck. My hand grasped the knob, and as I yanked the door open, I fell. Not into the school basement, but into a classroom. It was full of students sitting motionless at their desks, their heads bowed, their skin pale and waxy. The teacher stood at the chalkboard, her back to me, writing the same words over and over. No one leaves. When she turned, her face was a void, featureless except for a pair of hollow eyes that glowed faintly red. She raised a ruler, pointing directly at me, and the students lifted their heads in unison, their faces identical, blank, expressionless, but with mouths that began to chant. Stay, stay, stay. I bolted back through the door, only to find myself in the same hallway, the lockers now oozing black liquid that pooled around my feet. The figure from earlier was waiting, its grin wider, its claws dripping with something dark. It lunged again, and this time I couldn't run. My feet wouldn't move. I screamed as its hand closed around my throat, pulling me into the darkness. When I woke up, I was in the school nurse's office, my friends staring at me with pale, terrified faces. They said I had been missing for 3 days, and when they found me, I was lying outside the basement door, my clothes soaked in blood that wasn't mine. I tried to tell them what happened, but every time I spoke, my throat burned as if something was clawing at it from the inside. That night, I dreamed of the forgotten hallway, and when I woke, my phone had a single new notification. A photo of me, standing in the classroom, grinning with hollow eyes. I'll never forget the night I learned the truth about Blackridge High, though sometimes I wish I could carve the memories from my skull. The school had always been cloaked in rumors. Stories of students who disappeared, teachers who resigned without explanation, and the West Wing, permanently sealed off with rusting chains and a "do not enter" sign faded from years of neglect. They said it was because of a fire decades ago, but I knew there was more to it. My friends dared me to break in after hours, convinced me it was just a silly legend, a good scare for Halloween. I shouldn't have agreed, but there I was, the lone idiot standing in front of the chain doors while the others waited outside, laughing nervously as I slipped through a gap in the chain. The hallway smelled of mildew and something sickly sweet, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast just enough of a glow to make out the eerie shapes of desks piled in the corners, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. My phone's flashlight was my only comfort as I moved deeper into the West Wing, each step echoing down the endless corridor. I don't know when it started, but at some point, I noticed the whispers, soft at first, like the wind brushing against glass, but growing louder and more insistent the farther I walked. I couldn't make out the words, but they weren't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. They were everywhere. I told myself it was just the building settling, my nerves playing tricks, but then I saw them, the lockers. They were opening and closing on their own, banging shut in a slow, deliberate rhythm like some kind of metallic heartbeat. My throat tightened as I approached one of them, and as I peered inside, the light caught something. A photograph, old and faded, showing a group of students I didn't recognize standing in the very hallway I was in, their faces blurred and twisted, except for one. A girl stood in the center, staring directly at the camera, her eyes impossibly wide, her expression a frozen scream. I stumbled back, and that's when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy like it had been buried underground for years. Spinning around, I found no one there, but the whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched, mocking, and somehow childlike, though it came from no visible source. Panic surged through me, but when I turned to leave, the hallway had changed, stretching endlessly in both directions. My phone glitched, flickering with static, and then the screen displayed a single word, "Stay." The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, and suddenly the walls began to shift, the peeling paint curling to reveal grotesque images etched underneath. Faces screaming in agony, hands clawing at nothing, eyes following me wherever I moved. I ran, or at least I tried to, but the floor felt sticky, like it was holding me in place, and then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but the reflection in my phone screen showed her. The girl from the photo, her head tilted unnaturally, her mouth moving but emitting no sound. When I finally mustered the courage to look, she was right in front of me, her eyes black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. She reached for me, her fingers elongated and sharp, and as they touched my skin, I was overcome with a cold so profound it felt like my soul was being ripped from my body. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was her whisper, right in my ear, "You'll never leave." When I woke up, it was daylight, and I was lying in the middle of the school courtyard, surrounded by confused teachers and students. I tried to tell them what happened, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. The West Wing had been sealed for years, they said, and no one could have gotten inside. But when I checked my phone, the photo was still there. Only now my face was among the blurred, screaming students. They always say there's something about old buildings that holds memories, but Crescent Ridge High felt like it held more than memories, it held grudges. It was an aging, crumbling shell of a school that had seen generations pass through its doors, and the more time I spent there, the more I felt like it was alive, watching, waiting. The seniors liked to spread tales about the old auditorium, a part of the school closed off decades ago after a student had gone missing during a play rehearsal. They said she'd been found weeks later, still wearing her costume, sitting in the front row, but no one ever dared to elaborate on how or why. The only thing I knew for sure was that the auditorium was locked up tighter than the principal's office, with a padlock so rusted it seemed like it had been there since the dawn of time. I wouldn't have cared about any of it if I hadn't been forced into detention that Friday night. The regular room was under renovation, so they stuck us in a classroom adjacent to the old auditorium. It was me, 3 other unlucky students, and Mr. Calloway, the grumpiest teacher alive. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, and the air felt heavy, as if the building was holding its breath. The others passed notes and whispered about daring each other to sneak into the auditorium, but I stayed quiet, feeling a strange pull toward the locked doors. I didn't know why. I just felt like something on the other side was calling to me. When Mr. Calloway left to use the bathroom, they dared me to go first, and like an idiot, I agreed. The lock wasn't as secure as it looked. It popped open with a single twist of a paperclip. The doors groaned as I pushed them open, revealing a pitch-black void that smelled of mildew and something metallic. The others shoved me forward, laughing nervously, but their voices faded as soon as I crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind me, and when I turned, I was alone. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of broken seats and a stage covered in tattered curtains. The silence was deafening at first, but then I heard it. Faint music, like an old, warped record spinning somewhere in the distance. I walked slowly, the sound of my footsteps muffled, as if the air itself was swallowing the noise. The stage seemed impossibly far away, but I kept moving, drawn to it by an inexplicable compulsion. That's when I saw her. A girl standing center stage, her back to me, wearing a torn, dusty costume that shimmered faintly in the dim light. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling, but she didn't respond. As I got closer, I noticed that her hair was matted, her shoulders unnaturally stiff, and her arms hung limply at her sides. "Are you okay?" I asked, reaching out, but the second my hand brushed her shoulder, she whipped around, and I stumbled back in horror. Her face was pale and lifeless, her eyes sunken black pits that seemed to draw me in, and her mouth was stitched shut with thick, black thread. She didn't move, but I heard her voice. No, not heard it. Felt it, inside my skull, like she was whispering directly into my mind. "Stay." The lights overhead flickered violently, and suddenly the room was alive with movement. Shadows slithered along the walls, and the seats were filled with figures. Students, teachers, all staring at me with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. They clapped slowly, the sound echoing unnaturally, as if mocking my presence. I ran for the doors, but no matter how far I ran, the exit never got closer. The auditorium stretched endlessly, and the whispers began to swirl around me, growing louder, overlapping, until they were deafening. "Stay with us. Join the show. It's your turn now." I fell to the ground, covering my ears, but the whispers turned to laughter, shrill and maddening. When I looked up, the girl was there, standing over me, her stitched mouth stretching impossibly wide into a smile. Her hand reached out and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The last thing I saw was her finger pointing to the audience as the shadows descended on me, clawing and pulling until everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting in one of the auditorium seats, my phone dead in my hand, the doors wide open in front of me. Mr. Calloway and the others were gone, the hallway beyond eerily silent. I staggered out, heart pounding, and tried to explain what happened, but no one believed me. They said there was no detention that night, that the old auditorium had been sealed for years. But I know what I saw, and every night since, I've heard faint applause in my dreams, felt the cold grip of her hand on my shoulder. Sometimes, when I walk past the school after dark, The lights in the auditorium flicker on, and I swear I can hear the music again, calling me back. I never believed the stories about what happened after dark at Ridgeway High, but that was before I found myself stuck in detention on the wrong night, in the wrong room. It started like any other after-school punishment, me, slumped in the back row of room 213, trying to kill time while the old wall clock ticked painfully slow. Mr. Grayson, our history teacher, sat at his desk flipping through a book he didn't seem to be reading, the kind of guy who treated detention like a sacred duty. There were only 3 of us that night. Me, a quiet girl named Erin, and Danny, the class clown who always seemed to end up in trouble. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow. About an hour in, something strange happened. The clock froze. I didn't notice at first, too focused on doodling in my notebook, but Danny pointed it out. "Guess time really does stop in detention," he joked. But then Mr. Grayson glanced up, his face pale and tight, and muttered something under his breath about maintenance issues. That's when we heard it. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. Mr. Grayson told us to stay put and left the room to check. We waited, joking nervously, until 5 minutes passed and he didn't come back. Danny decided to peek into the hallway, but the moment he opened the door, a gust of freezing air rushed in, and the lights flickered violently. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back. Erin and I joined him, but when we looked out, the hallway wasn't the same. The familiar lockers were gone, replaced by rusted metal ones, their doors hanging ajar. The floor tiles were cracked and stained with something dark that looked like dried blood. The walls were smeared with handprints, claw marks, and strange symbols I couldn't understand. Worst of all, the air was thick with a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint echo of those same slow footsteps, now coming from somewhere deeper in the school. We called out for Mr. Grayson, but there was no answer. "We should leave," Erin whispered, her voice trembling. Danny, trying to act brave, insisted we look for Mr. Grayson first, so we ventured into the hallway together. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pressing down on us. The school seemed impossibly large now, the corridors stretching endlessly in both directions. The more we walked, the more wrong everything felt. The classrooms we passed were empty, their windows shattered, desks overturned. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, nothing was there. We found a staircase that seemed to spiral downward forever, and against all reason, Danny decided to go down. "You can stay here if you want," he said, forcing a grin, but neither Erin nor I wanted to be alone. The air grew colder as we descended, the walls damp and slimy. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a basement that didn't exist in the real Ridgeway High. It was a cavernous, echoing space filled with rows of desks, each occupied by something or someone. At first, I thought they were mannequins, their heads bowed, their bodies stiff and lifeless. But as we got closer, I realized they were students. Students I recognized, though their faces were pale and their eyes wide open, staring blankly at nothing. One of them was my friend Marcus, who'd gone missing last year. Another was Lucy, a girl I'd barely spoken to but remembered hearing about when she disappeared 2 years ago. "This can't be real," Erin whimpered, clutching my arm. Danny, trying to suppress his fear, approached one of the figures, reaching out to touch it. The second his hand made contact, the figure's head snapped up, its mouth opening impossibly wide in a silent scream. The others followed suit, their heads jerking upward, their mouths stretching into grotesque grins as they all turned to look at us. The sound of footsteps returned, louder now, closer. From the far end of the room, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, its face shrouded in darkness. It carried a bell, which it rang slowly, the sound echoing like a death knell. With each chime, the figures in the desks began to move, their stiff bodies lurching toward us. "Run!" Danny shouted, and we bolted back toward the staircase, but the steps were gone. The space behind us had transformed into a solid wall. Trapped, we scrambled between the rows of desks, dodging the grasping hands of the figures. Erin tripped, and when I turned to help her, I saw one of the things grab her ankle. She screamed as it dragged her backward, her nails clawing at the floor. Danny and I tried to pull her free, but the figures were too strong. Her screams stopped abruptly, and when we turned, Erin was sitting in one of the desks, her face blank and lifeless, just like the others. Danny and I kept running, the sound of the bell growing louder and faster. We found a door at the far end of the room and threw it open, only to find ourselves back in room 213. It looked normal again, the clock ticking, the fluorescent lights buzzing. But Erin wasn't with us, and neither was Mr. Grayson. Danny collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered, but I couldn't answer. Before I could even think, the bell rang, once, twice, 3 times. When I looked at the clock, the hands weren't moving. Danny looked at me, his face pale. "It's still detention," he said, his voice shaking. The door slammed shut, and the room grew colder. I glanced at the window and saw our reflections, mine and Danny's, but there was something else behind us. A figure, tall and dark, holding a bell. The last thing I remember was its grin, sharp and gleaming, as the bell rang one final time. When I woke up, I was alone, sitting at one of the desks, with no sign of Danny or Erin. The clock was ticking again, but the time was wrong, years ahead of what it should have been. I ran out of the room, out of the school, but nothing was the same. Ridgeway High was abandoned, covered in vines and decay, and the world outside felt alien, wrong, as if I'd stepped into a time and place that didn't belong to me. But every night since, I've heard that bell in my dreams, and every morning I wake up sitting in that same desk, no matter where I fall asleep. I think I'm still in detention, and I don't think I'll ever leave.